Beth Hodgson. She is Principal Engineer and President of Spring Environmental. Beth, we are so thankful to have you on board today, and we look forward to your presentation. I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to you and have you share your presentation.
Thank you, Rhett. Okay, tell me when. There we go. Can you see the screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the chance to meet with you today. This is a little bit of a different topic than maybe some of the other things that you have focused on as far as safety. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about hazardous materials and management of them. A little bit of background for you. One, I was invited here based on a presentation that I gave at the Safety Fest conference in Coeur d'Alene in February, but I've been dealing with hazardous materials as well as air quality, hazardous waste, water quality, industrial hygiene and safety for more than 30 years. I am one of the many transplants to the region. I'm originally from upstate New York, and I studied chemical engineering and chemistry at Clarkson University, and then worked for General Electric for 4 years as a process engineer, and then transitioned into environmental and safety. Moved out to the West Coast and was in Portland for 2 years before moving to Spokane, which is where I am based. I was here for a year, and I'd always planned to start my own company, so that's what I did. So Spring Environmental is a small environmental health and safety company. We work about a 300-mile radius of Spokane for the most part. Part of my intention was to make sure that local businesses had access to professional services. So that's a little bit about myself. What we're going to talk about today is hazmat and hazwaste. This has been one of my passions over the years. I would not describe myself as an environmentalist. I would say much more as a conservationist, but I think a big part of it is to know the hazards and how we're managing our materials. So today we're going to talk a little bit about hazardous materials, just what's the purpose or the point of this conversation. We're also going to talk about life cycle analysis or life cycles for hazardous materials. We're going to give you a little bit of a refresher, as was mentioned earlier, relative to Hazwaste and what some of our considerations are for transitioning those hazardous materials that we don't need anymore into a hazardous waste stream. And then we're going to move this kind of to a closure relative to the term cradle to grave. So that's the scope for today. If you have any questions as we are going through the program, feel free to post your questions in the chat box. And Rhett, I'm hoping that you can facilitate that a little bit if there's something that should be chimed in at the time. But otherwise, we will circle back to those at the end as well.
Certainly.
Thank you. So we're going to start out talking a little bit about hazardous materials and a little bit about where this comes from as far as this conversation. You guys deal with hazardous materials in a variety of contexts. And in point of fact, in my world as a consultant, we deal quite a bit with a variety of different regulatory drivers for this. It is not just OSHA. So we have a lot of them that are driving the management of hazardous materials. So hazardous materials can have a variety of different properties. A lot of times people think about a hazardous material as an acid or as a solvent and have a very specific category that they fall into. Hazardous materials are more driven based on the effect that they can have, whether it's on people, property, or the environment. So when we talk about hazardous materials, I do want to differentiate a little bit on the terms hazardous materials versus hazardous waste. Some of you also deal with the term hazardous substances. That is another category as well, but I'm going to focus on these two right now. So the first part is talking about a hazardous material. And basically a hazardous material is anything that has the potential to cause harm to people, property, or the environment. And it can cause harm physically, it can cause harm to intrinsically. So there's different aspects that can come into play. The other consideration with hazardous materials is whether it can cause harm when it interacts with something else. So for example, an oxidizer in and unto itself sitting in a container is not harmful. when it comes in contact with flammable materials or when it comes in contact with corrosive materials, it can contribute to a fire. When we talk about hazardous waste is a subcategory of hazardous materials. Most of the regulatory agencies don't really focus on this as a category, but hazardous waste is basically defined as some type of material that is no longer has value for its intended purposes, and it can cause harm if it's handled incorrectly. So this is a short list of regulatory agencies that have some type of guidelines or regulations associated with hazardous materials. And just to I'm just going to put them in a nutshell. OSHA is focused on hazardous materials and its impact on you and I as an employee, versus EPA is focused on hazardous materials and their impact on the environment. DOT is focused on hazardous materials during transit, and it can be an impact relative to the environment or what happens in the mode of transportation. Department of Health is more focused on hazardous materials and how they may affect the public. It's also driven through the drinking water and the solid waste programs, but simplistic perspective is overall public. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is more focused on specifically radioactive materials and its effect both on employees as well as the public. Food and Drug Administration and Drug Enforcement Agency, we tend to think about them a little bit more relative to consumer type of products. Most of us don't sit there and say, oh, I have a glass of wine today, this is a hazardous material, but in point of fact, it meets the definition of being a hazardous material. Also, many of our drugs that you may take that are prescription drugs, for example, as well as non-prescription drugs, are materials that are regulated by these organizations, and they are also regulated as hazardous materials. Department of Agriculture has their own set of regulations associated with hazardous materials, specifically related to pesticides and herbicides. The regulations are from EPA, but they specifically develop the implementation programs for those, as well as have regulations for managing those. And then I added the fire department in as well, because in my world, as far as setting up programs for facilities, the fire department, the uniform building codes, or the international building codes can have a lot of impact on how we store materials, where they're stored, or how they're managed. So just kind of hitting on some of those agencies. And I want to show you that hazardous materials there are some type of definitions or descriptions in all of those organizations, which you can see on the left here. But hazardous waste is only defined by EPA. No one else defines a hazardous waste. It is specifically by EPA. It is implemented here in Washington State by the Washington State Department of Ecology. So this gets a little bit into one of my passions, is talking about this term cradle to grave. Now, cradle to grave in the hazardous waste world says anything you create, you own forever. But actually, I encourage people to think about hazardous materials in not just how we created a waste stream, but where are the hazardous materials coming into our process? How are they being used? And then what's happening when we turn into waste. So when we talk about cradle to grave, we are looking at both the manufacturing itself. So manufacturing chemicals, whether it's manufacturing solvents or oxidizers, or whether it's caulkings or oils. Also the transportation of hazardous materials, which can drive for us a little bit relative to hazardous materials and their impact on the environment or people. Processing hazardous materials can change them into something else. It can render, if you were to neutralize an acid, for example, it can make it so that it is non-hazardous, but processing can also create something more hazardous. And then we also look at residues, and for want of a better term, residues are frequently types of waste. Versus a byproduct is something that's created, but may have some use elsewhere. So when we look at the cradle to grave program, it's not just to say, hey, I have waste and we own it forever, but it is looking at materials that are hazardous, either how they're created or how they're processed in the facility. So I'm going to expand on that one a little bit more as we go along. When we talk about life cycle, a lot of times we're looking at hazardous materials and saying, oh, things only go wrong when we manage something incorrectly. We have explosions, or we have cleanup sites, or we have injuries, and it's just related to, you know, an improper management. But in point of fact, it can also be when facilities or operations have done things correctly, but the result of that process has still generated something that is hazardous. So some of you, based on the audience that I saw here, may be more familiar with some of these incidents than others. But these are some of the disasters that occurred in the 1970s and 80s. You know, when we talk about OSHA being established in 1970 for its current manifestation, a lot of the environmental regulations were initially established in the 60s and then developed from there as well. But in Hazwaste, Italy, this was basically an incident that occurred when the facility was operating completely correctly, except that Italy's policy was that the operations had to shut down for the weekend. So employees weren't allowed to work on the weekend. And so they shut down this processing facility and just said, okay, turn it off. And so they shut down the facility. But in point of fact, the facility was generating this dioxin, and the dioxin is a polymerization process. So when they shut down the equipment, the process didn't stop. And as many of you know, polymerization actually generates heat as part of the process, which tends to promote the continued reaction. So in this particular case, TCDD was just when the explosion occurred, it was distributed over 6.9 square miles. And this one did not lead to fatalities per se, but this was one of the big drivers relative to hazmat regulations, and specifically pointed out that all the people within this area were exposed, and many of them demonstrated symptoms of chloracne. And so then they maintained that for the rest of their lives. Well, Paul, India, again, this one was a little bit more scary from the perspective that so many people died. And this one was from methyl isocyanate escaping from an insecticide plant when the facility was not able to maintain the containers. Chernobyl, we've heard about it as well, relative to the power plant exploding and just disseminating radioactive material throughout the community. So this is the 1970s and 80s, and today we want to look at it and say, yeah, that's great. That was a long time ago. We have regulations, we have policies in place for this. Even into the late 80s and 90s here in the United States, Henderson, Nevada. Some of you may have seen the stories relative to this one. This was a facility that generated rocket fuel, and this facility produced rocket fuel, and when the shuttles were basically grounded for a period of time, they continued to produce rocket fuel. Well, like anything else, if you're producing rocket fuel and you have no place to put it, you just find another place to put it. So they stored this rocket fuel all over the property, and there was a spark of some sort or another to the containers, and the facility exploded. And then it ended up propagating throughout the whole facility when this ammonium perchlorate, when the first few drums exploded. So 2 people died and 372 people were injured in this incident. Phillips in Pasadena, Texas. This was the Houston Chemical Complex. Essentially, they were again producing a polymer, so high density polyethylene. And this was just a routine maintenance activity, but basically they had not done the correct sequence for opening and closing valves. And so they released 85,000 pounds of the flammable gases from the facility, killed 23 people and injured 315 others. Angus Chemical is another fertilizer facility. This one was essentially where a small fire started at the facility, and then an explosion occurred 30 seconds later. The blast associated with this killed 8 workers at the plant and injured 120. Again, late 80s, early 90s, again, we've got all these programs in place. PSM was developed. We had new programs in place to protect whether it was industrial facilities or operational facilities. Over the past decade, we had a couple of other situations. Some of you may be familiar with a West Texas fertilizer facility that exploded. Again, it was a fertilizer facility that were storing ammonium nitrate on site. And if you notice on here, if you aren't familiar with the situation, 15 people died. 14 of them were emergency responders. Only the one person was not an emergency responder, and he actually lived in the community and died of a heart attack. 200 more people were injured in that incident. Tesoro in 2014 had a facility, again, where they had essentially had a process malfunction where they were not routing the material to the correct location. And as a result, the facility had, this one again resulted out with a large fire. And then Prior Trust in Oklahoma, this is a drilling operation, and essentially they had a large explosion at this facility. So again, this past decade. And here in the Pacific Northwest in 2010, Tesoro and Anacortes, and I'm sure this has been part of the discussions that have occurred over time, but 7 employees died there when a heat exchanger had catastrophically failed. So these are just some of the disasters that occurred relative to hazardous materials, and you might look at it and say, well, that's great, but that's not us. We're in construction, we're dealing with small amounts of materials. Some of you may recognize this list, but I'll touch base with a few of them here. This list of chemicals are chemicals that were all being managed according to regulations at the time that they were being used. And today they have they've caused problems at facilities or with individuals. PCBs were initially included in transformer oils due to their high dielectric strength and that they weren't flammable. And that's resulted in a lot of cleanups that have occurred at facilities. Some of you may be familiar with using methylene chloride as a degreaser or as a solvent. It's a fantastic degreaser. It's just a carcinogen today. Carbon tetrachloride, a similar issue. It's a great polar solvent, but it is non-flammable, non-explosive, no residual odors, but it is also now defined as being a carcinogen. Some other ones that are identified on here, some of you can relate to BPA. If you try to buy a water bottle today and it squishes so that you can barely hold on to it, BPA provided some durability and some strength to some of those plastic bottles, and those are no longer being used due to the teratogen effects of that material. Other ones, a couple of other ones towards the bottom. Phthalates is kind of an up-and-coming conversation. Phthalates are found in plastic tubing is one of the common places, and we're just doing some investigation for a client relative to this showing up in their wastewater, and it's due to plastic tubing. And we've resorted to using plastics in a lot of applications, and the monomers and some of the other components of the chemicals are seeping into the water systems. PFAS, many of you may have heard of it here in Spokane. We get to hear about it relative to Fairchild. But PFAS was only established in the 1950s. It was developed by DuPont, and many of us have Teflon coated pans. There are other places that it's used as well. But this is just to show you a list where these chemicals were not being managed incorrectly. They were following appropriate regulations at that time. But the life cycle for these materials is that many of them don't go away. Several of the ones that are listed on here, we refer to as forever chemicals because the process to degrade them is fairly significant. So when we talk about cradle to grave, I want to make sure people think about hazardous materials in the term of, how are we using them as raw materials? Are we manufacturing them? Are we processing them? And then what are we doing with them at the end of life? So I'm going to transition a little bit here to talking about end of life for them. So when we generate hazardous waste, we have to do something with it. And the first part of the process is identifying it and characterizing it for disposal. So I love this definition, and this is straight from EPA's regulation and Washington Department of Ecology's. And forget the whole high school physics definition of a solid. A solid waste, by definition, for hazardous waste purposes, is any solid, liquid, or containerized gas. So a lot of times people are focused on, well, it's a liquid, or this is not something that I have to worry about because it can go in the garbage, or I can throw it out at home.
Did you get those? They have the glasses there?
And we can't necessarily do that at our work environments. So some of the other considerations for us is, can we reuse materials? If you can reuse it for its intended purposes, then it is excluded from these rules. So it is nice if you can say, oh, I have a site here where we're painting a project, and oh, by the way, there's residual paint left and someone else can use that paint. Whether it is a charity or whether it is another project that you're at. If you can reuse it, it's not considered waste. So reuse is essentially reusing it for its intended purposes without having to process it. There are also certain other materials that are accepted or exceptions from the hazardous waste rules. For the most part, they don't apply for the type of work that you're doing as far as construction goes. But the big things that do come into play is that domestic or household type of waste are both excluded, as long as they're not combined with something else. So this comes into play, you know, something as simple as porta-johns. If somebody throws aerosol cans into a porta-john, it makes that porta-john a hazardous waste. If someone puts aerosol cans into the trash can, it makes the trash can hazardous waste. So making sure that we manage our materials, that we keep them segregated at our work sites will ensure that you don't end up increasing the amount of hazardous waste that you're generating. So when we talk about hazardous waste, I'm going to focus a little bit more on containers at this point. And for purposes of hazardous waste generation, a lot of it comes into play relative to just simply generator knowledge. Do you know where you got the material? I will caution you, and most of us have some context for that, but do not assume that what it says on your safety data sheet is how you should be managing your waste, because about 75% of the time your safety data sheet will say something like comply with all federal, state, and local regulations. So don't resort to that as your end all be all for managing a waste. The other thing to be aware of is that Washington state is more stringent than the federal regulations. So even if somebody was providing guidance in there that was appropriate, that information may only be appropriate if you're working in Idaho, for example, which does comply with the federal regulations rather than Washington's more stringent. Other considerations are for us is that whatever the waste stream is may require testing. So when we look at waste, I want to just kind of give you a big picture of what we look at for characterization. When we're looking at materials that we're getting rid of, like you want to get rid of some solvent, you had a leftover solvent and you don't need it anymore. If the solvent has a single active ingredient and it is listed in the regulations, there's a discarded chemical list. If it's listed in this, then it's automatically classified. If you said, oh, it's got 2 active ingredients or 2 hazardous components to it, then we won't be using this list. The second category is for hazardous waste sources. And again, in the construction world, this one doesn't tend to apply as much. These are predominantly industrial type of sources. The categories that do apply relative to construction are the solvents that you're using. So there are 5 codes on here that are related specifically to the solvents. And if you're using chlorinated solvents as part of your process in some way, shape, or form as a degreaser or as a solvent, that material can render anything that it comes in contact with, any waste generated down the road, as being regulated as a hazardous waste. In addition, if you're dealing with solvents, there's some of the solvents on here, just even paint thinner. Paint thinner has xylene in it, which will trigger this. Older paint thinner had toluene in it. Some people are using acetone, and acetone is regulated on here. So just be aware that the solvents that you're using in your process, anything that it comes in contact with that goes in the garbage is going to end up being a hazardous waste as well. The last category that we use for based on the federal regulation is characteristic, and there are 4 characteristics for hazardous waste. The first one is it ignitable? Many of us use the term flammable. This is a little bit different than DOT's definition. So if something came in with a hazmat label on it because it was regulated by DOT, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a hazardous waste, but it could be. But ignitable is specifically identified as having a flash point less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. For corrosive, this is similar to DOT's and OSHA's, and that's that it's less than or equal to a pH less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5. And by definition, for the federal definition, this could only apply to liquids. Reactive is basically any material that's unstable. We're going to touch base on a couple things later, but one of the most common things that you may not think of as being unstable is caulkings. And that's because you have a 2-part caulking or epoxy, and one part of that is a resin, and the other part of it is an oxidizer or an organic peroxide, and those two meet, and you're like, okay, great, it makes a solid when I'm done. The process of it, though, creates heat, and it's considered an unstable material. And then the last category for the federal rules is toxic. And there's a list of chemicals with thresholds for them. It includes 8 metals. It includes a lot of chlorinated compounds and several pesticides. In Washington, I mentioned Washington's a little bit more stringent. So the previous slide was focused on federal. It doesn't matter where you are in the United States, where your projects are, it will apply, and they have to be characterized with those categories. Here in Washington, if you generate your waste in Washington, if you ship it to Washington, so for example, you're doing work in Idaho or Montana, and you bring the material with you and then decide while you're at your offices here in Washington that it's now a waste, you now have to comply with this set of rules. So Washington has a category for additional toxic considerations, and this is based on how toxic it is to fish, rabbits, rats. And so there's a criteria that we use for characterization here. The caution I will give you is that almost any kind of metals contamination, so due to grinding, for example, would trigger this standard. The next category is persistent. And persistent, part of the regulation is based on halogenated materials. One of the cautions that's coming into play now is that we have a lot of materials that that are not necessarily chlorinated like a solvent, but in point of fact, they do have some chlorine or fluorine in them. The polyfluorinated alkylated substances, the PFAS, that is related to AFFF foam and related to a variety of different coatings, are also regulated here in Washington under usually the WPO1. The other category that you'll find here is refrigerants. So if you were to say, we don't need this refrigerant anymore, R22, you're like, we don't need the Freon anymore. There are specific rules that we have to comply with, and they are regulated more stringently in Washington if you don't take them to a recycle center. In Washington, we also regulate solids as corrosive. So if a material would otherwise be non-regulated in the federal realm, Washington has a protocol for testing whether or not a solid could fail the corrosive test. And then in Washington, we also regulate PCBs down to 2 parts per million. Anything over 50 parts per million is regulated for purposes of TSCA. But in Washington, it is regulated between 2 and 50 under ecology's dangerous waste regulations. So hazardous waste streams at our work sites can include things like caulkings or epoxies, things that are 2-part components or that are in some way, shape, or form using a catalyst to kick them off. We also have things, paint or aerosols, the cans for them are all regulated. In addition, any type of paint related materials, so cans, rags, all of these are regulated. A lot of times people are like, oh, there's no more solvent on it, it can just go in the garbage. And that's not necessarily true. There are specific protocols you have to follow in order to manage those correctly, because they are regulated as hazardous waste. Washington also regulates spent antifreeze. So again, if you're in Idaho, it is not regulated, but if you're in Washington, it is. This is only relative to ethylene glycol. So if your work sites are able to use propylene glycol, that does get you out of the regulation, even here in Washington. In addition, used oil. So you don't need the oil anymore. It could be automotive, it could be relative to equipment. That used oil, if you wanted to throw it in the trash or if you wanted to dump it on the ground, it is considered hazardous waste. There are ways to minimize the impact either through recycle programs, but otherwise you do have to manage oil as well as all the rags that came in contact with it as hazardous waste. Other things that you have at your work site, we refer to them as universal waste. They're listed here on the screen, but these can come up at any of your job sites. And there are specific protocols in place, but they are regulated as hazardous waste as well. What are we supposed to know about hazardous waste? Well, the big things are that we have specific storage requirements for that. So once you identify that you have a waste, and this is true on your construction sites, is to make sure that you set up staging areas for those. We have two categories of staging areas, both satellite accumulation areas and central accumulation areas, depending on how long your project site is. So work closely with your environmental people to make sure that these are categorized. The big things to recognize for you and I is that all of our containers of waste need to be labeled. And this category here shows you a little bit about the difference. So if it is a container that you're actively filling and it's next to the work area, it has to be labeled with either the words hazardous waste or dangerous waste or Washington only waste, something like that. And it has to be identified with the contents. The contents can be common vernacular, blue goo. As long as everybody recognizes what it is, that's fine. And then it also has to be identified with what the risk or the hazard is. If it's in your central accumulation area or you're going to generate more than 55 gallons of that material, it also has to include the accumulation date. And generally facilities that are ending up doing any type of cleanup where they end up with large quantities like this end up triggering this large quantity generator standard, and they have 90 days to get rid of it once it's started to generate. Labels are one of the easiest things to mess up as far as the sites go. So a big part of it is just recognizing what has to be on there. These are some basic guidance relative to our sites. So make sure it's legible and that you filled in what the contents was. The regulations allow anyone to use any type of label. So you can use DOT labels if it's appropriate for the hazards. You know, you have a flammable material, put a flammable label on it. These are the GHS HAZCOM labels. You can use them. Waste is not subject to GHS HAZCOM, but you can use them. You can also just write the words. It's toxic, corrosive, reactive. As far as ecology is concerned, you can use any of those terms. In Washington, we also have requirements about font size. The bottom line is you're supposed to be able to see it from a distance. So minimum of 1/2 an inch for your containers. When we store, some of the other considerations for it is to make sure that they're stored in some type of designated area, not just willy-nilly throughout a site. And they do have to be controlled when the process is not occurring. So that may be because it is a locked site, or it may be that they're getting put into a flammables cabinet, as an example. The containers have to be labeled. We also have to ensure that they're compatible with the other materials that they're stored with, that they're closed when they're not being added to or emptied. We also have to make sure that there's appropriate emergency response equipment available, which can include communication. If it's your central accumulation area, we do have to have secondary containment. So similar to OSHA's definition that it's 100% of the largest container or 10% of the total volume, whichever is greater. So this is just a quick little label that shows some of the considerations for a storage area. So I just want to pull this together here for the last couple of minutes and just talk about cradle to grave. When we generate waste at a site, under the regulations, you own it forever. So if you say, oh, I'm going to send it to George's landfill on his property because he's willing to take it, you now bought into George's property. Because when the agency comes back and says they're going to do a cleanup on that site, your company is going to be helping to pay for that. So just some considerations for us when we're looking at materials and what are the concerns for cradle to grave. A lot of it is, where is it starting? What is it starting with? Today we've had a lot of conversations about clean energy, and clean energy is also a consideration for us just relative to cradle to grave. Where are those hazardous materials coming from? When we talk about cradle to grave, how many of you recognize some of these materials? They may not have been identified to you as being hazardous, but all of these have some type of hazards associated with them. And I was in upstate New York at after 9/11, and when they opened up Fishkill landfill and found material that was completely identifiable, newspapers readily able to read, we need to recognize that putting stuff into a landfill is it's going to be there for a long time. And those landfills, when I was first in school, they were designed for 30 years. Today, they're designed for 50 years. How many of you know of a landfill being dug up and being processed in some other manner? Most of them are not, unless they were improperly designed. So one of our other considerations is working more on a cradle to cradle format, where basically the materials that we're generating can be used for something else. Like I said earlier, if you have paint that someone else can use, it is no longer considered waste. If you have solvents that someone else can use, it's no longer considered waste. That does not mean that you should send it home and put it in your garbage, by the way. But if you can use it at home and your company allows you to do that, then that's great. It allows it to be continued use and not to be waste. There are a lot of other pollution prevention resources out there. This is from Ecology's website on green chemistry and talks about a lot of other resources available to us to minimize the raw materials we're using so that they're not as hazardous. So that is my presentation. Does anyone have any questions in the next 2 minutes? Try to recognize or respect your time.
Beth, this was a very good presentation, and the way that you deliver the information is fantastic. And there's so much information. I know this taps into some folks' wheelhouses. Thank you so much. And folks, what questions do you have for Beth today? We certainly are appreciative of her joining, and we would love to hear from our group. Any questions?
Beth, can you send me the PowerPoint in case people want to have a copy of it? Okay, great.
I see some clapping coming up on there. Let's see. Excellent presentation, great information. Thank you. We love to hear from you guys, even if you don't speak verbally. Some people would like the PowerPoint presentation, Beth, in PDF or however, especially with your information on it, they can contact you. You are a wealth of knowledge. I see a lot of thank yous popping up, a lot of thumbs up. Oh, I do see a question here. Let's see. I see a hand. Christian, please.
Hey, thank you, Beth. I had a quick question regarding the plural component caulking you were talking about. Is there any specific way we need to store that, or is that just a heads up, hey, this is a hazardous chemical that we need to keep an eye on?
So recognizing it is a hazardous chemical, the storage of it themselves, the big thing with two-part, whatever it is, caulkings or epoxies, is making sure that they're kept cool. Because once they get heated, even though you might say, well, I never opened it, some of you can relate to having opened up a two-part epoxy or a two-part coating and finding out that it's solid. If it went solid, it created heat, which means that it is potentially an ignition source. So keep it cool. If you opened up a two-part epoxy, try to open them and finish them at the same time, because once you've come in contact with the epoxy or with the second part to it, it will continue to oxidize even in the container. And again, it's an ignition source. As far as
Okay,
waste goes,
so-
once it's solid, it's non-hazardous.
Right. So just store it in the cool area. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Thank you.